And this morning on Republic TV, we have a special guest, Dr. Rajveer Purohit, who's an associate professor at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. He has been speaking to us in the course of our broadcast in the last 2 months. Dr. Rajveer, good morning. And every time we speak, Dr. Rajveer, situation is changing and so rapidly. I remember when we first spoke, you were in New York, and New York was the epicenter. Uh, Situation is much different today. But before we get into the details of the analysis of what we had in mind about how US is coping, what is your analysis of where America stands today? Looking at the so-called curve that we've been talking about, you think it's on track to flatten it?
Well, good morning, Niranjan, viewers in India. There's a lot of things. First, New York City, we've seen a substantial decline in cases over time. In addition to that, I think that although the number of cases have declined over time in New York quite substantially, Mount Sinai had almost 2,000 cases of coronavirus in the hospital. Now we're less than 100 cases. So these kind of numbers. But as the cases have gotten less and less over, America, the number of cases are not in substantial. Few states, the cases are in a few states, and the cases are declining like substantially. So here in New York, we're definitely over the hump. We're almost where we were about 2 months ago when coronavirus really hit the city. And I think the efforts of the lockdown, the efforts of people really being cognizant of what's happening and being maintaining social distancing, all the things that all of the viewers already know a lot about, they've finally taken effect. It's important to remember when New York was first diagnosed on March, first case of coronavirus, 3 weeks before a lockdown. In India, Mumbai, particularly, lockdown occurred within 2 weeks. So much earlier, there was a national, America still was an lockdown. So what happened in New York was there wasn't a lockdown under natural.
Okay, I think we lost. The phone line with Dr. Rajveer there, and we'll just go back to him. But just to give our viewers an idea about the situation in New York, while we stay with the pictures. Now, in New York, just to give you an idea, if you go through the tracking of how New York performed and the situation in Mumbai. Now, many articles have been written, but there is no comparison at all. But the situation in New York this morning, the governor there saying that most places are expected to reopen as early as next week. In the first week of June, New York planning to reopen several parts, and New York has already started giving approvals for gathering as large or as small as 10 people. That's the updated order that's come from the governor after a lawsuit challenged his earlier rule that such gatherings would be permitted for religious occasions or Memorial Day celebrations. New Jersey, meanwhile, has allowed gatherings, mostly outdoor gatherings of 25 people. And these are some of the updates that we're getting from New York. And let me go across to Dr. Rajveer once again. Dr. Rajveer, I lost your audio at some point, but looking at many comparisons have been drawn, though mostly unfair comparisons. You can't really compare the situation in New York to the situation in, let's say, Mumbai or London. But certainly, looking at the number of cases, the figures as of 2 days ago in New York were roughly around 200,000, over 200,000, and over 20,000 deaths. In Mumbai, and I'm looking more at the percentages than the numbers, because you can't really compare the number. They're 10 times more than Mumbai. But the sheer percentage, for example, Mumbai accounting for about 22 to 23% of India's total cases. The deaths in Mumbai, for example, recording or amounting to about 25% of the deaths nationwide. In New York, The deaths recorded were nearly about 22% of the national average in America, and the cases also close to about 15%. So, do you see something similar there? And what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think there's a significant, in Mumbai, it has quite a different demographic population than New York does. And, it's important to remember, even though the population of Mumbai is larger than New York, almost 1.5 times the number as in New York, the total number of patients are far less than what's happened in New York. And the number of deaths are even lower than that. I think that can be attributed to a few things. For one, the population of Mumbai is much, much younger than the population of New York. Younger people, we know, do much, much better with coronavirus than older people do. So it's possible that there's a significant population of asymptomatic carriers in Mumbai, probably even larger than the numbers that have been tested. And the population is, because it's younger, has a much lower death rate than what New York has seen. The second thing to remember is that we're not really doing enough testing of antibodies. In New York, it's been shown that in the city itself, almost 21% of the population has antibodies to the disease, suggesting that the death rate is actually much lower than we think it is because of this large penetrance of the disease into the population. If you think about it, with Mumbai, it's very, very possible that a much larger number of patients, or the population actually already has antibodies and been exposed to it, but because they're younger, they never presented with the disease and no one ever tested them to check for the disease. So I think there are some things lessons we can draw. Hopefully, Mumbai won't get to a situation where there'll be an absence of hospital beds or ventilators. And if trends continue and Mumbai follows the path it's following, I think there's a reasonable chance the numbers will start declining over time, and it won't be in that situation.
Dr. Rajveer, you spoke about the antibodies and the testing facilities and the research around that. We've been speaking for the last few weeks. When we first spoke, there was a debate also about hydroxychloroquine, and then there was a consequent chat that we had where remdesivir was being discussed and also promoted by the government and the administration in America. Here in India, of course, we're very happy to announce that and companies and the Serum Institute of India has already spoken about a possible vaccine by as early as October 2020. Now, where does America stand on that front in terms of, one, the treatment to COVID-19, and second, the debate around the vaccine and the race for it?
Well, a few things. In terms of the treatment, we're still getting more and more data. We found, for example, I know plasma therapy is something we've talked about, Niranjan, in the past. A recent study has come out showing that it is safe. We're still trying to determine if it's effective or not. It looks like it's effective, but we've answered the first question, and is it safe to give to the population at large? In terms of medicines like remdesivir, we're also learning that it's also safe, and it's likely will probably reduce the length of stay for patients who are hospitalized. The question will be whether we can give it even earlier. And in terms of the vaccine, and there's a lot of good news. Remember, if you look at other diseases and other problems that we've conquered, such as smallpox, it's taken many, many years to come up with a vaccine. We're on warp speed right now, hyper speed, to come up with a vaccine. The American government has offered over $1 billion to a British unit at Oxford University, potentially, to develop this vaccine that looks very, very promising. October seems a little bit optimistic. I think we're looking at a timetable of around December for the vaccine to be hopefully begin to be mass-produced. And that's if everything goes perfectly. So we have to make sure that the vaccine is safe, which it looks like it is now. That's one of the most recent studies that have come out. We have to make sure that it's effective, and that's probably going to be a longer study that comes out with a larger number of patients. And hopefully we'll have to make sure that the coronavirus doesn't mutate and make it less effective over time. But, it's amazing. December, 1 year from the time that the virus was first discovered, we have a vaccine that could potentially be mass-produced is an amazing result, and it's a tribute and a triumph of science in some ways if we can get to that point. There's no guarantees we can get there, but I'm optimistic.
Well, you spoke about the younger population and the lower death rate, which of course is a good sign for Mumbai. But as far as the antibody testing is concerned, and we spoke about that, you think that's the way forward for a city like Mumbai? I remember there was once a study that said the antibody test showed that 1 in 5 residents of New York tested or rather showed positive using these tests. So is antibody testing an option, a viable option for a city like Mumbai?
I know. Absolutely. I think that there's two components of it. One is testing for the disease, active disease itself. So that comes with the nasopharyngeal swab. There's actually a potential saliva test that'll be done, and there's some potential of a home test that'll be done. So for the active disease itself, that's going to be the number one most important thing to do, to test widely to make sure patients or anyone who has the disease is isolated and doesn't spread it, particularly to vulnerable populations like the elderly or those with significant medical problems. Now, in terms of the antibody, I think it's an important test as well because it'll tell who is potentially immune from getting the disease in the future. That's the first thing. So healthcare providers, for example, should be tested not infrequently for antibodies to determine if they've already been exposed. But it also tells us a lot about the epidemiology and the demographics of the disease. So if we find out, for example, that 21% of the Mumbai population, like New York, has antibodies to this disease, then it tells us that the disease may not be as dangerous as we thought in some ways, that the death rate is going to be much, much lower than the 1% or 1.5% that some of the earlier studies had come out with. So it's important not just to determine who's potentially immune, but it's also important to understand sort of the kinetics of the disease and to understand, how this virus spreads, and that'll help us come up with better public health safety measures for the population at large.
Yeah, and finally, Dr. Rajveer, it's the biggest debate, how do you reopen or exit the lockdown? I know New York is also debating it. Most cities around the world are debating it on how's the best option to get out of it. Here in India, of course, flights will resume starting Monday. Most cities outside of the red zones or the containment zones have been allowed to resume economic activity, although not fully. In your view, what's New York doing, and what's the best way to tackle the situation?
Well, I wish we knew, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I think right now I can tell you what some of the hospitals are doing. So they're doing extensive testing. Any patient who gets surgery is tested for the virus. We also are starting to test for the antibodies. So we make sure that they don't actively have the disease. We're isolating patients who have the disease. We're obviously not proceeding with any kind of surgeries if they have the disease. I think the key to opening up the economy is going to be, in the short run, it's going to be extensive testing and frequent testing. So repeat testing of people who are potentially will be exposed to vulnerable populations. It'll be doing the standard stuff that all of your viewers know because you've talked about this extensively, including wearing a face mask in public, frequent hand washing. And it'll also be potentially looking at the vaccine in the long run. So if we can come up with a way to prevent people from getting the infection, that's the end point, the final solution. I think opening up the economy is going to be a very, very tricky process. It's going to take time. It's going to be rocky, and I think there's a potential of having a second bump in the disease. And the way to really prevent that ultimately is going to be with more testing and making sure that anyone who tests positive is isolated and really, really being careful about this and offering the test to anyone and continuing these public health measures that everyone knows about.
Okay, one last question, and I'm going to try and keep it short because I have to take a short break in about a minute. But Asymptomatic cases, one big concern in Mumbai. How did New York deal with that situation? Here in Mumbai, it's over 60 to 70%.
Well, at the end of the day, we have to test. If you know, the problem with asymptomatic carriers is that the virus replicates in the upper respiratory tract. And because it replicates in the upper respiratory tract, asymptomatic carriers can spread it to other people. So whether you think you have the disease or not, if you go out in public, you have to wear a face mask. You have to take the standard precautions to prevent that kind of spread. And this is what is the most challenging part of this whole disease, is that the virus spreads, replicates in the upper respiratory tract and can spread maybe even from conversations, but definitely with sneezing or coughing in asymptomatic carriers.
Okay, Dr. Rajveer, pleasure speaking to you, and hopefully the next time we speak, both Mumbai and New York would have presumed activity, normal activity, I'm hoping, but that's us hoping for the best, isn't it?
The next time I hope to be speaking with you from the park. Thank you so much, Niranjan.
Hopefully. Let's hope for the best, Dr. Rajveer. Thank you. Pleasure speaking to you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yep, bye.